Okay, so somewhere in America right now, there is a house that nobody will buy. Not because it's ugly, not because the neighborhood is bad. It might have new floors, a renovated kitchen, a fresh coat of paint, and a price that seems perfectly reasonable on paper. And it has been sitting there for 8 months, 10 months, sometimes years, with showings that never turn into offers, and offers that fall apart before closing. The owner drops the price. Nothing happens. They drop it again. Still nothing. Sounds almost impossible in a country desperate for housing supply, almost insultingly rare, the kind of story that surely only happens to a handful of unlucky sellers. And that is exactly the problem, because the unsellable house is not a rare accident. It is a permanent, structural feature of the American housing market, and it is far more common, far more expensive, and far more revealing about how real estate actually works than almost anyone realizes until they own one. Here is what the numbers actually look like. According to data tracked by real estate research firms, at any given moment, somewhere between 5 and 8% of homes actively listed for sale in the United States have been on the market for more than 6 months, a category the industry quietly refers to as stale inventory. In certain markets, rural counties, declining industrial towns, areas with structural oversupply, that number climbs past 20%. Across the country, there are consistently hundreds of thousands of homes sitting listed, unsold, month after month, while the broader narrative insists America has a housing shortage. Both things are true simultaneously. There is a shortage of the homes people want and a glut of the homes nobody does, and the gap between those two categories is where an entire hidden economics lesson lives. So let's actually go inside and understand what makes a house genuinely unsellable, because it is almost never just one thing. It is usually a stack of problems, each one survivable alone, that combine into something buyers instinctively avoid. The first and most common category is location-based obsolescence, a house built for a world that no longer exists around it. Think of homes built adjacent to a factory that has since closed, leaving the local job base gone and the population shrinking. Think of homes in flood zones that didn't used to flood, until changing weather patterns and outdated drainage infrastructure made annual flooding a certainty rather than a risk. Think of homes near a highway expansion, a new industrial facility, or a landfill that didn't exist when the house was originally built. The house itself hasn't changed, the world around it has, and the house is now anchored to a location that has lost its economic reason to exist. The second category is physical and structural. Foundation problems are the single most feared words in real estate for a reason. A cracked or shifting foundation can cost $10,000 to $50,000 to properly repair, and buyers who see it in an inspection report will either walk away entirely or demand a price reduction so steep it barely resembles the original listing. Outdated or dangerous electrical systems, knob and tube wiring, aluminum wiring from the 1960s and 70s, aren't just inconvenient, they are often uninsurable, which means a buyer literally cannot get a mortgage on the property because no lender will issue a loan on a home that can't be insured. Polybutylene plumbing, installed widely in the 1980s and 90s before it was discovered to fail catastrophically over time, creates the same problem. Mold from long-term water intrusion, unpermitted additions that a county won't recognize, structural work done without inspection. Each one of these is a landmine that shows up during due diligence and kills deals that looked perfectly normal at the open house. The third category is legal and financial, and this one surprises people the most because it has nothing to do with the physical house at all. Title defects, unresolved liens from a previous owner's unpaid contractor, boundary disputes with a neighbor over where the property line actually sits, unpermitted structures that create code violations, an easement that gives a utility company or a neighbor legal rights to cross the property, homes still tangled in probate court because an owner died without a clear will, homes with underlying HOA litigation or special assessments that transfer to the new buyer. None of these are visible on a walkthrough. All of them can stop a sale cold, sometimes after the buyer has already spent thousands on inspections and appraisals, only to discover the title company won't clear the transaction. Now, let's talk about what it actually costs to own a house that has failed to sell, because most people radically underestimate the ongoing burn rate of a property that sits empty. Here is where a lot of sellers get blindsided. The mental model most people carry is, well, it's just sitting there, what's the harm? Here is what actually happens. Every single month that house doesn't sell, it is still costing its owner real money, whether or not anyone is living in it. Take a median-priced American home, roughly $420,000, still carrying a mortgage. If that mortgage payment, principal, interest, taxes, and insurance runs around $2,800 a month, and the house sits unsold for a year, that is $33,600 in carrying costs on a property generating zero income and zero use. Add utilities kept running to prevent pipes from freezing or mold from developing in an empty structure, another $150 to $300 a month. Add lawn care and basic maintenance to keep the property from visibly decaying and scaring off buyers even further, another $100 to $200 a month. Add homeowners insurance, which often increases on vacant properties because insurers consider them higher risk for vandalism, fire, and undetected water damage, sometimes 50 to 60% higher than an occupied home policy. Stack all of that together, and a house that sits unsold for a full year can cost its owner $40,000 to $50,000 in pure carrying costs, money spent with nothing coming back, on top of whatever they originally paid for the property. Here's the part that makes this so much worse than a normal financial loss. Every month the house sits unsold, and the price gets cut, the market starts to notice, and that noticing becomes its own problem. Real estate agents track something called days on market, and buyers, whether they realize it or not, use it as a signal. A house that has been listed for 45 days looks normal. A house that has been listed for 220 days looks suspicious. Buyers start to assume something is wrong with it, even if the actual issue is something mundane, like an unusual floor plan or an overpriced initial listing. This creates a vicious cycle, sometimes called the stale listing spiral. The longer it sits, the more buyers assume there's a hidden flaw. The more buyers assume that, the fewer showings the house gets. The fewer showings, the longer it sits. Agents sometimes recommend pulling a listing entirely and relisting it as new after 90 days specifically to reset this psychological days on market counter, an entire industry workaround built around the fact that time on market itself becomes a liability independent of the house's actual condition. If you're finding this breakdown useful, consider subscribing and dropping a like. It genuinely helps this kind of content reach more people, and there's a lot more of this coming. Here's the part of this story that almost nobody talks about, and it might be the single most financially devastating category of unsellable house in America: the zombie property. These are homes caught in foreclosure limbo, where a bank has initiated foreclosure proceedings but never completes them, sometimes for years, because completing the foreclosure means the bank has to take on the liability and carrying costs of an asset it doesn't actually want yet. Researchers who study this phenomenon have found hundreds of thousands of these properties scattered across the country, homes where the original owner has moved out, believing they lost the house, while the bank has quietly not finished the paperwork. Nobody is paying the taxes. Nobody is maintaining the property. Nobody has clear legal authority to sell it. The house sits, decaying, technically owned by someone, functionally owned by no one, dragging down the value of every property around it, while contributing nothing to anyone. Some of these zombie properties have sat in this exact legal purgatory for over a decade. A house that is simultaneously an asset on a bank's books and a complete write-off in every practical sense, worth less every year it goes unaddressed, precisely because nobody with the legal authority to fix it has any financial incentive to do so quickly. Now let's build the actual financial model, because the abstract version of this story undersells how much money genuinely evaporates. Take a seller who bought a house for $380,000 3 years ago and now needs to sell due to a job relocation. They listed at $420,000, a reasonable estimate based on comparable sales nearby. But their house has one of the problems we described, say, an outdated septic system that will require $18,000 in replacement, disclosed upfront per state law. Buyers see that disclosure and immediately factor it into every offer, either walking away or lowballing. Month 1, no offers. Month 2, They dropped to $405,000. Still nothing, because buyers researching septic replacement costs assume the true condition-adjusted value is closer to $390,000 once you subtract the repair. Month 4, they drop to $395,000 and finally receive an offer, but it comes in at $375,000, with the buyer demanding a $15,000 credit at closing to cover the septic work themselves. By the time this seller factors in 4 months of carrying costs, roughly $14,000, the reduced sale price compared to their original estimate, $45,000 lower than they hoped, and the closing credit, they walk away from this house with nearly $60,000 less than they expected when they first listed it. The house didn't lose that value overnight. It lost it slowly, one price cut and one carrying cost month at a time, because the market was pricing in a problem the seller initially hoped buyers wouldn't notice or would overlook. Let's talk about the volatility angle. Because unsellable inventory is not evenly distributed across the housing cycle, it concentrates violently during downturns. During the 2008 housing crash, the number of homes sitting on the market for more than a year exploded across the country, particularly in overbuilt exurban markets in states like Nevada, Arizona, and Florida, where speculative construction had wildly outpaced actual demand. Some subdivisions built during the boom years sat with entire blocks of unsold or foreclosed homes for the better part of a decade, values crushed 40 to 60% from their peak, with some individual properties changing hands for less than the cost of the land beneath them. The lesson from that period is that unsellable inventory isn't just a property-level problem, it's a market-level warning signal. When days-on-market figures start climbing broadly across a region rather than just for individual troubled properties, it typically means the area built more housing than the underlying economy can actually support. And that imbalance can take the better part of a decade to fully correct, because new supply doesn't disappear, it just sits there, slowly deteriorating, waiting for demand to eventually catch up. Here are the underestimated costs that rarely make it into anyone's calculation before they list a struggling property. The first is deferred maintenance acceleration. An occupied house gets small problems fixed as they happen. A vacant, unsold house does not, and small problems compound. A minor roof leak that would have been noticed and patched by someone living there becomes, over 8 empty months, a rotted section of subroof and hidden mold growth, discovered only when a buyer's inspector climbs into the attic. The second is opportunity cost on the seller's next move. Someone who needs to relocate for a job but can't sell their current house often ends up either declining the opportunity entirely or carrying 2 housing payments simultaneously, their old mortgage and a new rent or mortgage, sometimes for 6 months or more, a direct cash cost that rarely gets included in anyone's estimate of what a slow sale actually costs. The third is the price anchoring problem. Once a house has been publicly listed at a certain price and failed to sell, that number becomes public record on real estate websites. Future buyers researching the property's history see the original ask and every subsequent price cut, and it becomes almost impossible to convince anyone the house is worth more than its lowest previously listed price, permanently damaging the ceiling on what the property can eventually fetch, sometimes for years after the underlying problem has actually been fixed. There's a real case study that illustrates exactly how this plays out at scale. In parts of the Rust Belt, cities like Youngstown, Ohio, and Flint, Michigan, experienced such severe population decline following decades of manufacturing job losses that entire residential blocks became functionally unsellable, not because any individual house had a defect, but because there simply weren't enough buyers left in the local economy to absorb the existing housing stock. Local governments in both cities eventually turned to aggressive demolition programs, tearing down thousands of structurally sound but permanently unmarketable homes, because a vacant lot, believe it or not, was calculated to be worth more to the city and to neighboring property values than a decaying, unsellable house left standing. That is a genuinely strange outcome if you think about it purely as a construction question, a perfectly functional building being deliberately destroyed, but it makes complete sense as an economics question. A house's value isn't just the cost of the materials and labor that built it. It's entirely dependent on there being enough people who want to live in that specific location. Remove the people, and the structure becomes a liability rather than an asset, regardless of its physical condition. Let's be precise about what separates a house that eventually sells at a discount from a house that becomes genuinely, structurally unsellable. A discount house has a defined, quantifiable problem. Buyers can price it. A cracked foundation costs a known dollar range to fix, so buyers simply subtract that estimate from their offer and the house sells, just for less. A genuinely unsellable house has an unquantifiable problem, unclear title, unresolved litigation, a location with no remaining economic reason to exist. Buyers can't price an unknown, so instead of discounting, they walk away entirely. This is the critical distinction almost nobody articulates clearly. It's not that unsellable houses are simply more expensive versions of discounted houses. It's that they represent a category buyers structurally cannot evaluate, and markets are extremely bad at pricing things they cannot evaluate. They just avoid them instead. Let's close with the two scenarios. The optimistic case: a seller with a genuinely troubled property identifies the specific issue early, gets a pre-listing inspection before ever putting the house on the market, fixes what's fixable, clearly discloses and prices in what isn't, and lists at a realistic condition-adjusted number from day one. The house sells within 60 to 90 days, at a fair discount reflecting its real condition. No stale listing spiral, no reputation damage, no accumulating carrying costs. Total loss versus a theoretically perfect house. Maybe $25,000 to $40,000. Painful but bounded and predictable. The realistic case: the seller lists at an optimistic price hoping nobody notices the underlying problem. The house sits, the days on market counter climbs. Buyers start assuming a defect even before finding the real one. Multiple price cuts follow. Carrying costs accumulate for 8 months to a year. A sale finally happens at a steep discount, with major closing concessions, and the seller has also been paying for a second living situation the entire time. Total loss: $70,000 to $100,000 or more, and a permanent public price history that haunts the property's value long after the actual defect has been resolved. The difference between those two outcomes isn't the size of the underlying problem. It's almost entirely about how honestly and how early that problem was priced into the listing. Here is what this actually is. Once you strip away the assumption that every house eventually sells if you just wait long enough or drop the price enough. A house is not automatically worth what it costs to build, or what similar houses nearby are selling for, or what the owner emotionally believes it should be worth. It is worth exactly what a buyer with full information is willing to pay for it, today, in its current condition, in its current location. When any of those variables breaks down badly enough, no buyer exists at any reasonable price, and the asset simply stops functioning as an asset at all. It becomes a liability wearing the shape of a house. Every empty, decaying, years unsold property scattered across this country is a small monument to that exact economic truth. That value isn't inherent in a structure. It's assigned by a market, and markets can, and regularly do, simply refuse to show up. If you want to go deeper on how property valuation actually breaks down, check out the detailed guide linked in the description and pinned in the first comment. It covers the full mechanics of how distressed and hard-to-sell real estate gets priced, far beyond what we covered here. If you found this breakdown valuable, please like the video and subscribe if you haven't already. It genuinely helps the channel grow, and there's a lot more coming.